tutorial is how to make a chart with two separate y-axes. So here I have my table where I plotted my pH, my change in pH, so I just took the second pH, subtracted it from the first one, and did that all the way down. I also have my burette reading, which gave me my titrant volume and also my change in volume. So titrant volume is essentially the volume of acid that I've added. I then created a column that was change in pH over change in volume. And essentially what that gave me was the slope of my titration curve. So what I want to plot now is the titration curve and the slope of the titration curve. So I'm going to come in here, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create my figure. So I come in to charts, and I'm going to click on smooth marked scatter plot. So that gave me my template here, and I'm just going to make it a little bit larger. And the next thing I want to do is I want to select my data. So I'm going to right click somewhere in the middle of the chart and hit select data. I'm going to have two different series. So the first thing I'm going to do over in the series box, add series, and the first one I'm going to call titration curve. My X values are going to be the titrant volume, so how much acid was I adding. My Y value is going to be pH, so I'm essentially plotting pH versus acid added, and you can see my titration curve here. The next series I'm going to add, so I'm going to add a series, I'm going to call slope of titration curve. For this one, my X values are going to remain the same, so titrant volume or acid added. But for my Y values, I'm going to add change in pH over change in volume or the slope. And you can see it plotted those points there. So I'm going to hit OK. So when I look at this, what Excel tried to do was essentially plot both of these points on the same y-axis. But that doesn't really make sense, because then what is the y-axis showing? What are the values? What is better to see are two separate y-axes. And the way I do that is I'm going to select my slope of titration curve. So click anywhere on the line, and then I'm going to right click and I'm going to select Format Data Series. Come up here, and under Axis, so up here, I'm going to put Plot Series on Secondary Axis. So essentially what that did was now my titration curve has its axis on the left side of my graph, and I would read the slope of my titration curve on the right y-axis. So I'm going to move this legend just out of the way for a second, because the next thing I want to do is add my chart titles, because at this point I have no idea what those values mean, what are the units. So I'm going to come into chart layout, and I'm going to select axis titles. And the first thing I want to do is my primary horizontal axis. Put that in, and I'm going to change this to volume of acid added in milliliters. The next thing I'm going to do is put my two y-axis labels in. So I'm going to come over to axis titles again. First, I'm going to do my primary vertical axis title. And I'm going to change this to pH. And the next thing I'm going to do is add my secondary axis title. So I come in here, secondary vertical axis title. I'm going to put in my rotated title, and this is going to be slope of titration curve, which is pH over acid added. Okay, so at this point I have my graph made. If I want to extend it out, I can select the entire graph and I can pull it across. I can change my font. It's a little bit small, so I'm going to come up here and make my font 12 point. So I can see it better. And the next thing I want to do is play with the minimum values. I want to change what's going on my y-axis. And the reason I want to do that is it's hard for me to see those inflection points here on this curve because my pH is going from 0 to 10. But really, the lowest pH I had was 3.99. So I'm going to click somewhere on the y-axis. Oops, sorry. And I'm going to right-click Format Axis. Under here, under the scale, I'm going to change the minimum from 0 to 3. Now I'm getting a little bit better of a curve because I'm just looking at those values that I'm interested in. I can also change the style of this line so I can see them a little bit different, because if I plotted this in black and white, it might be hard to tell which is which. So anytime you want to change the style of a line, you click on the line, right click, and you go to Format Data Series. Under here, I can change the marker fill, I can change the marker style. So maybe instead of squares, I want it to be X's, and I want it to be a little bit smaller. I can also come in and change the type of line. So if I go to weights, line, weights, and arrows, I'm going to make it a dotted line, and I'm going to make it thinner. A little too thin. Hit OK. So you can see that changed that style, and it also updated my legend here. So the legend is clear. I can do the same thing if I want to the other line. I'm just going to move this down a little bit. There we go. Oops, I moved the entire graph down. Let's go ahead and pick that back up. All right. I'm going to click on the line, right click, Format Data Series, come in here, and I'm just going to change the line to a dashed line. Okay. You can see that updated my legend. Now at this point, I've created a figure that shows clearly where the peaks of my slope are. Those peaks correspond to my endpoints for the titration. So at this point, I could put this in a publication, I could put this in a deliverable, and my reader would know exactly where those points are, or I can look in the table and figure out, okay, where were those peaks in the slope. So the first one is here at 2.67, and that corresponded to a pH of 8.27. So although we said our titration endpoint was 8.3, more accurately, it was actually 8.27. I can do the same thing with the second peak, which is here at 3.33, which corresponds to a pH of 4.5. So I've now created my graph with two y-axes, and that is the end of this tutorial.